The smell of roasted rosemary and garlic usually makes me feel at home, but this Christmas, it just felt like the scent of a closing trap. I had been in the kitchen since 5 in the morning, my hands stained with beet juice and my back aching from the kind of labor you only do for people you think love you. I didn't mind the work at the time. I was Elena, the reliable one, the one who made sure the table looked like a magazine spread and every gift under the tree was wrapped with hospital corners. I had spent exactly $1,200 on them this year. I remember the number because I had to move money from my personal savings to cover the leather jacket my husband, Mark, just had to have, and the designer handbag his mother, Sylvia, had been hinting about since August. I thought I was buying peace. I thought I was investing in my family. The table was set for 12. Silverware polished, crystal glasses catching the light, and a 20-pound turkey sitting in the center like a peace offering. But as soon as Sylvia sat down, the air shifted. She didn't look at the food. She looked at me with a thin, sharp smile that never reached her eyes. She made a show of adjusting her napkin, then sighed loudly. She told the table that it was such a shame some people think money and cooking can make up for a lack of true family spirit. Her sister nodded in agreement, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, that I always did try too hard to buy my way into their good graces. Mark wouldn't look at me. He just stared at his wine glass, swirling the expensive Cabernet I'd bought, his face a mask of bored indifference. I felt that first cold prickle of unease. The realization that I was the only person in the room who wasn't in on a joke. Throughout the meal, the jabs became more frequent and less subtle. They talked about Mark's old girlfriend, the one who apparently had class and came from the right kind of background. They laughed about how lucky Mark was to have a family that could guide him back to the right path. I stayed silent, clearing plates and refilling drinks, playing the role of the dutiful ghost they treated me as. I kept telling myself to just get through the dessert. Once the guests left, Mark and I would talk. We would find our way back. I was so incredibly wrong. When the coffee was served, Sylvia stood up. She reached into her silk robe and pulled out a thick, white envelope. She told the entire table that Christmas was a time for fresh starts and for shedding burdens that no longer served the family's future. She walked over to me, her heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood floor I had waxed by hand. She handed me the envelope with a flourish, telling me it was the one thing the whole family had chipped in to give me. I opened it, my fingers trembling slightly, expecting perhaps a cruel card or a bill. Instead, I pulled out legal documents. It was a divorce petition, already signed by Mark and witnessed by his mother. The room went silent, but it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of a crowd watching a car crash, eager to see the blood. Mark finally looked up, but there was no regret in his eyes, only a smug kind of relief, as if he had finally taken out the trash. Sylvia leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice, and whispered that I should probably start packing my little suitcases before the new year. She told me the family had decided they were done with my presents. They were all smirking, waiting for me to cry. But they forgot one tiny detail about the deed to this house. I stared at the black ink of Mark's signature, and for a second, the world went strangely quiet. It was like the ringing in your ears after a sudden blast. I looked at Mark, waiting for a flicker of the man I'd supported for 6 years. The man I'd helped through 3 job losses and a soul-searching phase that really just meant him playing video games while I worked 60-hour weeks. But that man was gone, if he ever existed at all. Instead, I saw a stranger with a weak chin and a cruel mouth, bolstered by his mother's presence. Sylvia was still hovering, her eyes dancing with the thrill of the kill. She started talking about how we think it's best for Mark to find someone more suited to his stature, someone who didn't come from a service background. It was a setup. The whole night, the 12-hour turkey, the hand-picked gifts, the expensive wine. It was all designed as a theatrical backdrop for my execution. They wanted me to break down in front of Mark's cousins and his affluent aunts, so they could spend the next decade talking about how unstable I was. They wanted a clean break where I'd be too humiliated to fight back, scurrying away into the night, while they kept the warmth and the walls I had provided. They truly believed they were the ones discarding me, finally cutting loose the help that had overstayed its welcome. My mind flashed back to every time Mark had forgotten his wallet at dinner, or every time Sylvia had a medical emergency, that conveniently cost exactly what I had in my bonus check. I had been their silent engine, their private ATM, the invisible hand that kept their world from crumbling while they looked down their noses at me. I thought about the text messages I'd seen on Mark's phone 3 months ago. The ones from a girl named Tiffany. I'd ignored them, convinced myself I was being paranoid. That Mark was just lonely, because I worked too much. Standing there with the divorce papers in my hand, I realized I hadn't been working too much for us. I'd been working too much to fund his infidelity and his mother's delusions of grandeur. Mark finally spoke, his voice thin and rehearsed. He told me he'd already moved my things into the garage. Well, the things he deemed mine. He said he'd be staying here, of course, to help his mother settle in after the stress of the holidays. The audacity was almost breathtaking. They had sat in this dining room, under the chandelier I'd paid to have rewired, eating off the china I'd bought for our 3rd anniversary, and planned how to kick me out of my own life. They didn't even have the dignity to do it in private. They wanted the audience. They wanted the public victory of seeing the family mistake finally cast out. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. The kind of stillness that comes when you realize the person you were protecting is actually the one holding the knife. I looked around the room. The crown molding I'd painted, the rugs I'd scrubbed, the warmth they were currently basking in. They thought they were the kings of this castle, and I was just a tenant they were evicting. If they wanted me out of their lives, I was happy to oblige. But they didn't realize they were already living in my world. I stood there for a long moment, just letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them. Sylvia was actually humming a Christmas carol under her breath. A satisfied little tune as she began to reach for a second helping of my maple-glazed sweet potatoes. Mark was leaning back, looking at the ceiling, probably already imagining how he'd redecorate the den, once my books and hobby gear were hauled off to the dump. They were so certain. They were so incredibly smug in their ignorance. They had spent years treating me like a lucky interloper who had stumbled into their family's grace, but they had never once bothered to ask how a man like Mark, who changed jobs as often as he changed his socks, managed to live in a 4-bedroom colonial in a zip code like this. They thought this house was a family legacy. That was the lie Mark had told them. And honestly, the lie I had let him tell because I was too tired to fight about his ego. He had told Sylvia that his grandfather had left him a sizable, private trust that covered the down payment and the mortgage. In reality, Mark's grandfather had died with exactly $42 in his checking account and a collection of rusted fishing lures. The trust was actually me. It was 5 years of me working my corporate job from 8 to 5, then driving 30 miles to pull a night shift at a data entry firm from 7 to midnight. It was 5 years of me eating ramen in my car, so I could save every single cent of my bonuses. When the original owner, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, decided to sell, he didn't want to list it. He liked me. He saw me working those double shifts while Mark was finding his passion on the couch. Mr. Henderson made me a secret deal. He sold me the house for 20% under market value, provided I could put down a massive cash deposit to keep the banks from poking around his business. I did it. I drained every account I had. I signed the deed in my name only, as a premarital asset, because even then, a small, quiet part of my brain whispered that Mark's passion didn't include financial responsibility. "You really think you're staying here, Mark?" I asked. My voice was quiet, devoid of the shaking they expected. Sylvia snorted, not even looking up from her plate. She told me that family property stays with the family. And since I was now an outsider, I had no claim to the ancestral home. She actually used that word. Ancestral. As if her son hadn't moved in here 3 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag and a mountain of credit card debt. I looked at the cousins, the aunts, and the uncles who were all nodding along, enjoying the spectacle of my displacement. They had all been living under the same delusion, that I was a guest in the house of Mark. I remembered the early mornings, scraping frost off my windshield at 4 a.m. to get to the office, my hands so cold I could barely grip the steering wheel. All while Mark slept soundly in the bed I had bought. I thought about the rent Sylvia was supposed to be paying for the mother-in-law suite I'd renovated for her. She hadn't paid a dime in 2 years. She told Mark she was diversifying her retirement portfolio for our future benefit. In reality, she was spending her Social Security checks on cruise ship deposits and jewelry, confident that her provider's son would always have a roof over her head. She didn't realize that the roof, the walls, and the very dirt beneath her feet belonged to the woman she had just handed divorce papers to. They had lived here rent-free, tax-free, and worry-free because I had carried the weight of their entitlement on my back until my spine was ready to snap. They viewed my hard work as their birthright. They viewed my silence as subservience. They thought that by serving them dinner, I was acknowledging my lower status in their hierarchy. But you don't own a kingdom just because you sit at the table. You own it because you hold the keys. I walked over to the sideboard, where I'd hidden my own gift behind a decorative bowl of pine cones. I pulled the manila envelope from under the sideboard. It wasn't a thank you card. I didn't open the envelope immediately. I just let it rest on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the gravy boat. Sylvia looked at it with a mixture of boredom and irritation, likely assuming I was presenting some pathetic, handwritten plea for Mark to take me back. She told me, quite sharply, that no amount of begging would change their minds, and that I was making the guests uncomfortable. Mark wouldn't even look at the paper. He was busy checking his watch, probably wondering how soon he could invite Tiffany over to sleep in my sheets. I leaned forward, my shadow stretching long across the table, and pushed the first document toward Sylvia. It wasn't a letter. It was a formal, 30-day notice to quit, backed by a pre-signed eviction filing. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of a trap. It was the silence of a vacuum. Sylvia picked up the paper, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She read the words notice of eviction and legal owner, Elena 3 times before her brain could process them. She laughed a shrill, nervous sound, and told me I was being hysterical. She turned to Mark and told him to tell his little wife to stop playing games. But Mark was staring at the second document I had slid across the table. The original deed to the house, stamped and filed long before our wedding day. His face went from a smug tan to a sickly, chalky white. He stammered that this was the family home. But the paper in his hand told a much colder story. I told them, in a voice as flat as a dial tone, that since they had been so kind as to provide me with divorce papers, I felt it was only right to finalize our living arrangements. I explained that I had been the sole owner of this property for years, and since there was no lease agreement and no record of rent payments from any of them, they were technically unauthorized occupants. The aunts and cousins started whispering, their eyes darting around the room as they realized the ancestral estate was actually a private residence they were currently trespassing in. Sylvia finally found her voice and screamed that I couldn't do this, that it was illegal to throw people out on Christmas. I reminded her that it was actually December 26th by now, and I wasn't throwing them out tonight. I was simply letting them know their time as leeches had reached its expiration date. But I wasn't finished. I checked my phone, watching the clock hit exactly 9 p.m. I told them that since I was no longer part of the family, I could no longer justify the massive overhead costs of maintaining their lifestyle. I had called the utility companies 3 days ago. I told the water, electric, and gas companies that I was vacating the property and to terminate service immediately. Sylvia shrieked that she had a right to heat, but I pointed out that she hadn't paid a utility bill since the Obama administration. I also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I had removed Sylvia's SUV from my commercial insurance policy. Since she didn't actually own the car, I did, and she didn't have her own insurance. She was currently sitting on 2 tons of uninsured metal that I would be reporting as unauthorized use by morning. The outrage was deafening. Mark tried to stand up, to play the big man, but I just held up a finger and told him to sit down. I told him that the Wi-Fi had just been cut, the Netflix account he used was deactivated, and his cell phone plan, which was part of my corporate bundle, would go dark in approximately 60 seconds. They looked at me as if I were a monster, completely ignoring the fact that they had spent the last hour trying to exile me into the cold with nothing but a signed paper. They wanted the benefits of my life without the burden of my presence. They wanted the warmth I provided while they kicked me out into the snow. As the lights flickered and the heat cut out, the screaming started. But the real bill was yet to come. The darkness in the dining room was only broken by the eerie glow of smartphone screens. Mark stood up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor I'd polished just last week. He tried to use his husband voice, that deep, authoritative tone he usually reserved for telling me why he couldn't help with the dishes. He ordered me to turn the lights back on and stop this psychotic break immediately. He actually called it a psychotic break. It's funny how men like Mark label a woman's boundaries as a mental collapse. I just sat there in the shadows, watching him fumble with his phone, realizing he couldn't even call for a pizza because his service was already cut. Sylvia, however, was faster. She didn't go for the thermostat. She went for her audience. I heard the familiar chime of a Facebook Live starting. Within seconds, she was performing. Her face was illuminated by the harsh white light of her screen, tears streaming down her face on command. She told her friends and family that I had lost my mind. She wailed into the camera about how they were being held hostage in the dark, how I was throwing a veteran's mother. She always conveniently remembered Mark's 6 months in the reserves when she needed sympathy, onto the street in the dead of winter. She called me a heartless, calculating stranger who had wormed her way into their hearts only to freeze them out. "Look at this," she shrieked, panning the camera around the darkened, expensive room, carefully avoiding the half-eaten gourmet meal I'd prepared. "She's turned off the heat. We're freezing. My son is being abused in his own home." My phone began to vibrate. Then it began to scream. Notifications from Mark's extended family, his friends from college, and even people I barely knew started flooding in. The flying monkeys had been released. Messages called me a gold-digging snake, a spiteful B-word, and told me that there was a special place in hell for people who ruin Christmas. Mark's cousin, the one who had just finished 3 helpings of my turkey, texted me to say I was vile, and that he was coming over to sort me out. I watched the viewer count on Sylvia's livestream climb. 200 people. 300. She was in her element, basking in the digital pity. Mark was behind her, nodding solemnly, playing the part of the grieving, betrayed husband. They really thought that by dragging me into the town square of social media, I would fold. They thought the shame of public opinion would force me to turn the power back on and tear up the eviction notice. They forgot that I had spent years being the quiet one, because I was busy documenting everything. I opened my laptop, the battery still at 90%, and logged into the Facebook thread where Sylvia's video was currently trending in our local community group. I didn't type out a long, emotional defense. I didn't beg for understanding. I simply started uploading attachments. First, I posted a high-resolution scan of the property deed, dated 2 years before I even met Mark. Underneath it I wrote, "I am the sole owner. No family money was ever involved." Next, I posted the lease agreement I had drawn up for Sylvia a year ago when she claimed she wanted to feel like a contributing member of the household. It was signed by her, showing a monthly rent of $0, provided she maintained the property. I followed that with a screenshot of the $0 total she had contributed to the household expenses in the last 24 months. But I saved the best for last. While Sylvia was still mid-sentence about my unprovoked cruelty, I uploaded a folder of screenshots from Mark's deleted folder in his cloud storage, the one he thought I didn't know the password to. There was Mark, in a hotel room I'd paid for during his business trip, posing with Tiffany. There were the messages where he joked about how the ATM, that was his nickname for me, was working late again so they could afford a nicer dinner. I hit enter. The comments on the live stream stopped moving for a heartbeat, then they exploded. The pity evaporated, replaced by a wave of shock from the neighbors and friends who were seeing the saintly Mark for who he really was. I watched Sylvia's face change in real time as she read the comments. Her jaw dropped. She looked at Mark, then at the phone, then at me. The performance was over. The screen went black as she abruptly ended the feed. But I wasn't done with the digital cleanup. I had a curated list of everyone who had just sent me a death threat or an insult. My phone was blowing up with hate, until I sent the spreadsheet to the entire family group chat. The silence in the room was no longer heavy, it was suffocating. I opened the spreadsheet on my laptop, the screen's white light reflecting off my glasses, casting a clinical glow across the faces of my stunned in-laws. For years, they had viewed my career in accounting as a cute little hobby that kept me busy while the real family work, their drama, their demands, their social standing, took center stage. They didn't realize that to an accountant, every betrayal has a decimal point. Every lie has a corresponding line item. I turned the laptop screen toward Mark and Sylvia, who were sitting huddled together in the dark like two people who had just realized the lifeboat they were in was made of lead. I started at the top. Year 1. I pointed to the entry for the property taxes. Mark had told everyone he handled the big bills, but the receipts showed my personal checking account being drained every November for the last 4 years to prevent a tax lien on the house. That was $12,000 right there. Then, I moved to the mother-in-law suite. I had the invoices for the plumbing, the new flooring, and the climate control I'd installed so Sylvia wouldn't have to suffer in the humidity. $18,000. I looked her in the eye and reminded her that she'd promised to pay me back once her settlement came through. The settlement had come through 16 months ago. I knew because I'd seen the Instagram photos of her new gold watch. Then came the life subsidies. This was the section that made Mark's hands start to shake. I had tracked every emergency car repair for a vehicle he didn't own, every networking lunch that was actually a bar tab with his friends, and every cent of the credit card debt I'd cleared for him, so we could qualify for a better interest rate on a car he eventually crashed. I had it all categorized: food and beverage, entertainment, unaccounted cash withdrawals, and the Tiffany fund. The total for the jewelry and hotel rooms I had unknowingly financed while I was working overtime. Let's talk about fair market rent, I said, my voice echoing in the unheated room. I had printed out a comparative market analysis for this zip code. For a 4-bedroom home with a private suite, the rent was $3,500 a month. For 4 years, they had paid exactly $0. I did the math out loud, letting the numbers hang in the air like a sentence. $168,000 in lost rental income. I told them I was being generous by only calculating the last 40 months. I showed them the grand total at the bottom of the screen, highlighted in a cold, unforgiving red. $142,684. Sylvia tried to scoff, but it came out as a weak, wheezing sound. She told me I couldn't charge family rent retroactively. She said there was no contract. I leaned in and showed her the digital signature on the household contribution agreement she had signed 2 years ago when she wanted me to co-sign for her SUV. In the fine print, the print she was too arrogant to read, it stated that in the event of a material breach of family trust, all deferred costs would become due and payable immediately. Mark's infidelity and their attempt to fraudulently claim my property were the very definition of a material breach. Mark finally found his voice, though it was high-pitched and desperate. He told me I was being insane, and that no court would ever uphold a ridiculous spreadsheet over the sanctity of a marriage. I reminded him that we were no longer talking about a marriage. We were talking about a business dissolution. I had been the CEO, the CFO, and the sole investor in the Mark and Sylvia show, and I was now officially declaring bankruptcy on their behalf. I didn't care about the money in the sense that I expected them to have it. I knew they were broke. I knew that without my paycheck, they couldn't even afford the gas to drive away from this house. The point of the audit wasn't just recovery, it was the total destruction of their narrative. They couldn't walk away and tell people I was a bitter ex who took everything. They had to live with the knowledge that I had been their lifeline, and they had spent years trying to bite the hand that fed them. I closed the laptop with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The heat was gone, and the temperature in the house was dropping fast. I could see their breath in the air now, little puffs of white that signaled their time was up. I stood up, walked to the front door, and opened it, letting the freezing December wind howl into the foyer, swirling the snow across the expensive rug they had just been sitting on. I told them they had 24 hours to vacate, or I'd sue for every cent of the $142,000 back rent. That's when things got physical. By the time the sun rose on Boxing Day, the festive cheer of the neighborhood had been replaced by a grim, suburban standoff. I wasn't inside the house anymore. I had spent the night at a nearby hotel, enjoying a hot shower and a bed that didn't feel like a crime scene. When I drove back at 8 a.m., I found that Mark and Sylvia had spent the night busy. They hadn't been packing suitcases. They had been fortifying a fortress of delusion. Every door was deadbolt from the inside, and I could see the heavy oak dresser from the guest room shoved against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the foyer. I stood on my frozen lawn, the grass crunching under my boots, and held up my phone to record. I didn't yell. I didn't pound on the glass. I just watched. Through the second-story window, I saw the screen pop out and hit the driveway with a metallic clang. Then came the first of my belongings. A box of my grandmother's vintage tea sets shattered against the pavement, white porcelain spraying like shrapnel. Next came my clothes, balled up and soaked in what smelled like bleach, fluttering down to the oil-stained concrete. Sylvia leaned out of the window, her hair matted and her face contorted with a frantic, ugly energy. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a trespasser now. She yelled for the neighbors to hear that they were exercising their squatters' rights, and that because they had lived there for more than 30 days, I couldn't touch them without a 2-year court battle. She actually cackled, telling me that by the time the sheriff showed up in the spring, there wouldn't be a single piece of my trash left in her house. Mark appeared behind her, dumping a drawer full of my jewelry, mostly costume pieces but sentimental nonetheless, into the bushes below. He looked emboldened by the barricade, convinced that 4 walls and a locked bolt made him the owner. The neighbors began to emerge from their homes, clutching mugs of coffee, their eyes wide as they witnessed the perfect family imploding on the sidewalk. I saw Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down recording on her own phone, her face twisted in horror as my laptop bag, thankfully empty, hit the roof of my car. Sylvia saw the audience and played to it, shrieking that I was trying to make an elderly woman homeless in a blizzard. She was leaning hard into the squatters' rights narrative she must have spent all night Googling on her data-limited phone. She thought she had found a loophole. She thought that if she stayed inside and kept the doors locked, the world would eventually just give up and let her keep the prize. I remained perfectly still, capturing every flying object on video. I recorded the damage to the siding, the broken window frame, and the sheer malice on their faces. Every item they threw was another line item in the lawsuit I was already drafting in my head. They were destroying their own leverage, thinking they were hurting me. In reality, they were just providing me with a mountain of evidence for a willful destruction of property charge. Mark shouted down that I should just go back to whatever hovel I came from, because this was a family home. And I wasn't family anymore. He actually looked proud of himself, standing amidst the wreckage of my life. I looked at my watch. It was 9:15 a.m. I had called the local precinct an hour ago, not to report a domestic dispute, but to request an escort for a peaceful reclamation of private property. I had also made another call. Sylvia saw a dark SUV pull up behind my car, and her smirk faltered for a second. She likely thought it was my lawyer. She was wrong. It was much more official than that. I turned my camera from the house to the street, capturing the arrival of the authorities. I had spent the morning briefing with my stack of titles, deeds, and the cash for keys, agreement they had both signed and notarized a year prior. They thought the law was on their side. They were wrong. I wasn't alone when I went back to the front door. By the time the sun rose on Boxing Day, the festive cheer of the neighborhood had been replaced by a grim, suburban standoff. I wasn't inside the house anymore. I had spent the night at a nearby hotel, enjoying a hot shower and a bed that didn't feel like a crime scene. When I drove back at 8 a.m., I found that Mark and Sylvia had spent the night busy. They hadn't been packing suitcases. They had been fortifying a fortress of delusion. Every door was deadbolt from the inside, and I could see the heavy oak dresser from the guest room shoved against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the foyer. I stood on my frozen lawn, the grass crunching under my boots, and held up my phone to record. I didn't yell. I didn't pound on the glass. I just watched. Through the second-story window, I saw the screen pop out and hit the driveway with a metallic clang. Then came the first of my belongings. A box of my grandmother's vintage tea sets shattered against the pavement, white porcelain spraying like shrapnel. Next came my clothes, balled up and soaked in what smelled like bleach, fluttering down to the oil-stained concrete. Sylvia leaned out of the window, her hair matted and her face contorted with a frantic, ugly energy. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a trespasser now. She yelled for the neighbors to hear that they were exercising their squatters' rights, and that because they had lived there for more than 30 days, I couldn't touch them without a 2-year court battle. She actually cackled, telling me that by the time the sheriff showed up in the spring, there wouldn't be a single piece of my trash left in her house. Mark appeared behind her, dumping a drawer full of my jewelry, mostly costume pieces, but sentimental nonetheless, into the bushes below. He looked emboldened by the barricade, convinced that 4 walls and a locked bolt made him the owner. The neighbors began to emerge from their homes, clutching mugs of coffee, their eyes wide as they witnessed the perfect family imploding on the sidewalk. I saw Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down recording on her own phone, her face twisted in horror as my laptop bag, thankfully empty, hit the roof of my car. Sylvia saw the audience and played to it, shrieking that I was trying to make an elderly woman homeless in a blizzard. She was leaning hard into the squatters' rights narrative she must have spent all night Googling on her data-limited phone. She thought she had found a loophole. She thought that if she stayed inside and kept the doors locked, the world would eventually just give up and let her keep the prize. I remained perfectly still, capturing every flying object on video. I recorded the damage to the siding, the broken window frame, and the sheer malice on their faces. Every item they threw was another line item in the lawsuit I was already drafting in my head. They were destroying their own leverage, thinking they were hurting me. In reality, they were just providing me with a mountain of evidence for a willful destruction of property charge. Mark shouted down that I should just go back to whatever hovel I came from, because this was a family home, and I wasn't family anymore. He actually looked proud of himself, standing amidst the wreckage of my life. I looked at my watch. It was 9:15 a.m. I had called the local precinct an hour ago, not to report a domestic dispute, but to request an escort for a peaceful reclamation of private property. I had also made another call. Sylvia saw a dark SUV pull up behind my car, and her smirk faltered for a second. She likely thought it was my lawyer. She was wrong. It was much more official than that. I turned my camera from the house to the street, capturing the arrival of the authorities. I had spent the morning briefing with my stack of titles, deeds, and the cash for keys, agreement they had both signed and notarized a year prior. They thought the law was on their side. They were wrong. I wasn't alone when I went back to the front door. The flashing blue and red lights of the 2 patrol cars painted the snow-covered street in a rhythmic, clinical pulse. It was a stark, cold contrast to the warm Christmas lights still twinkling on the neighboring houses. As the officers stepped out, Sylvia's screams from the 2nd-story window reached a fever pitch. She was certain her salvation had arrived. She began shouting for them to arrest the intruder on her lawn, pointing a shaking finger at me as if I were a common thief. But the officers didn't look at me. They looked at the heavy man in the plain suit who had stepped out of the SUV. He was a process server, and in his hand was a file thick enough to end a dynasty. The lead officer, a stern man named Sergeant Miller, walked over to me first. I didn't say a word. I simply handed him the original, notarized cash for keys agreement from 18 months ago. This was the document Sylvia and Mark had signed when I'd caught them skimming from our joint emergency fund. I had agreed not to press charges then, provided they signed a document acknowledging they had no legal tenancy and would vacate within 24 hours upon written request. They had signed it greedily, thinking I'd never have the spine to use it. Sergeant Miller reviewed the paperwork, then looked up at the barricaded house. He signaled to his partner, who walked to the front door and hammered on it with a heavy fist. He didn't ask them to open up. He informed them that they were currently in violation of a legal order and were committing criminal trespass and destruction of property. Inside, the sound of furniture being dragged away from the door was frantic. When the bolt finally turned, Sylvia stumbled out, her face a mask of faux anguish. She tried to throw herself at the sergeant, sobbing about squatters' rights and elder abuse, but the officer simply stepped aside. "Ma'am," Miller said, his voice amplified by the quiet morning air. "We have a notarized affidavit stating you surrendered all residency rights a year ago. This isn't a civil eviction anymore. You're being removed for trespassing." That was when the neighborhood truly woke up. I expected judgment, or at least a few dirty looks for causing a scene on Boxing Day. Instead, I saw Mr. Henderson, the former owner, standing on his porch across the street, nodding in approval. Then the neighbors from the Blue House, people I had helped during the spring floods while Mark was busy at a retreat, started clapping. One by one, the people who had actually seen me working those double shifts and maintaining this property stepped onto their lawns. They weren't cheering for the drama. They were cheering for the truth. They had seen the saint being used as a doormat for too long. Sylvia looked around at the crowd, her mouth hanging open. She had spent years trying to craft a reputation as the grand dame of the block, and now, her peers were watching her get herded toward the sidewalk. The process server stepped forward and handed her a summons for the $142,000 audit I had prepared. She looked like she had been struck. She looked at the neighbors, then at the police, and finally at me. I didn't offer her a single word of comfort. I just kept my camera rolling as the reality of her total social and legal collapse set in. Watching the Emile be escorted out in her pajamas was great, but the look on my husband's face when the tow truck arrived was better. 2 weeks later, the dust hadn't just settled, it had buried them. The colonial house stood empty, the for sale sign on the front lawn a silent sentinel over the wreckage of my marriage. I had spent those 14 days in a blur of efficiency, working with a high-end stager to erase every trace of the people who had tried to steal my peace. The house sold in 48 hours. The market was hungry, and because I had maintained the property with obsessive care while Mark was busy finding himself, I walked away with a profit that felt like a secondary inheritance. It was more than enough to buy a penthouse in the city I'd dreamed of living in since I was 20. A place where the skyline is made of glass and the air doesn't smell like Sylvia's perfume and resentment. Mark and Sylvia didn't fare quite as well. Without my paycheck to act as their universal solvent, their lives dissolved with terrifying speed. Mark was currently living out of a budget motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the carpets smell like stale cigarettes and the Wi-Fi is as spotty as his loyalty. He had tried to move in with Tiffany, the girl he'd been bankrolling with my money, but she had ghosted him the moment she realized the ATM had been permanently deactivated. It turns out that when you lose your house, your car, and your credit limit in the span of a single afternoon, you lose your romantic appeal too. He was left with nothing but a suitcase of bleach-stained clothes, and the $142,000 lawsuit hanging over his head like a guillotine. Sylvia was in an even worse position. Her social standing had been her only currency, and I had effectively devalued it to zero. She had been forced into a 300-square-foot studio apartment in a senior living complex that she used to mock whenever we drove past it. There was no room for her designer handbags or her delusions of grandeur. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she spends her days calling the local police, trying to file reports against me for theft of her lifestyle. Only to be told, repeatedly, that everything I took was legally mine. The most satisfying part of their collapse, however, wasn't where they ended up, but how they treated each other once the money ran out. The saintly family had turned into a pit of vipers. From what I gathered through the grapevine and the occasional unhinged voicemail, they were tearing each other apart. Sylvia blamed Mark for choosing a girl who was too smart, and Mark blamed Sylvia for pushing Elena too far, with the Christmas dinner stunt. They were trapped in a cycle of mutual destruction. Two parasites with no host left to bleed. They had spent years united in their contempt for me, but without me as a common enemy to look down upon, they were forced to look at each other. They didn't like what they saw. The entitlement that they once used against me was now being weaponized within their tiny, cramped rooms. I was sitting on the balcony of my new place, watching the city lights flicker to life, when my phone buzzed. It was a group text, a rare move for them. It was a long, rambling message that read like it had been drafted by a committee of desperate people. They spoke about family values and forgiveness. They admitted that mistakes were made on both sides, which was their way of saying they were currently hungry, and the motel bill was due. Mark wrote about how much he missed our partnership, and Sylvia added a line about how she always thought of me as the daughter she never had. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a final attempt to pull the saint back into the cage, so she could start paying the bills again. They thought I was still that girl who would crumble if they just showed a hint of warmth. They thought my generosity was a weakness they could exploit one last time. They actually believed that after everything, the public humiliation, the divorce papers at dinner, the attempts to claim squatters' rights, that I would just open my checkbook and say, "Welcome home." They were still living in a world where I was the provider, and they were the elite. They hadn't realized that the version of Elena who took care of them died the moment that envelope touched the Christmas table. They tried to crawl back one last time with a heartfelt apology. I sent them one final attachment. I am sitting on a terrace overlooking the city, holding a glass of wine that costs more than Mark's monthly motel bill. The air here is clean, quiet, and entirely free of the suffocating expectation that I should set myself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. It's a strange thing, realizing that your greatest virtue was actually your greatest liability. For years, I wore my generosity like a badge of honor, thinking that if I just gave a little more, worked a little harder, or stayed a little quieter, I would finally earn the respect I deserved. I was wrong. People like Mark and Sylvia don't see a giver as a partner. They see a resource to be depleted until the well runs dry. Setting boundaries isn't about being mean, it's about being honest. The moment I stopped being their ATM, I became their villain, and that's a trade I'm willing to make every single day for the rest of my life. I've learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the absence of toxic people who create it. My new home has no mother-in-law suite, no hidden agendas, and the only person I have to take care of is the woman I spent 6 years neglecting while I was busy catering to monsters. I received a final update on the wreckage I left behind. Mark actually managed to find someone new. A woman he met at a bar who was impressed by his sophisticated background. He tried to pull the same routine, acting like a man of means who was just going through a temporary rough patch, due to a crazy ex. However, I made sure the financial audit I performed was part of the public court record for our divorce. His new girlfriend found the filings online, the full, itemized breakdown of his $142,000 debt, and his history of leeching. She dumped him via text before he even finished moving his one suitcase into her apartment. Mark is alone, Sylvia is in a box, and I am finally free. I used to think revenge was about anger, but I was wrong. Real revenge is simply handing people the bill for the life you provided, and watching them realize they can't afford it. If you think this was cold, wait until you hear what my sister tried to do with my inheritance 3 months later.